welcome. Thank you to all of you for coming out for this special adult and youth forum today. We appreciate you coming out, and also we're recording this, so welcome to everybody online who's watching this as well. So this presentation is called Standing Up to Hitler, Lutheran Pastor, Martyr, Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I want to acknowledge that two of my primary sources for this presentation are this book by Eric Metaxas called Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy. How's that for resume, huh? Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy. The martyr part means he was killed for his faith. And the other source is actually Wikipedia, which has many really good articles about this, all over this topic. Alright, let's learn about the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Lutheran pastor who was a resistor of fascism and a martyr for the faith. Let's begin. So, it was the morning of April 9th, 1945, at the Flossenburg concentration camp in Germany, where 30,000 Jews and political prisoners were brutally killed by the Nazis during the Second World War. During the war, the Nazis killed over 6 million Jews in extermination camps. But what you may not know is they also killed another 5 million people who were like political prisoners and gypsies, and gays, people with Down syndrome or any other mental deficiency or mental illness. Altogether 11 million people. April 9th, 1945 was very near the end of the war and all of that extermination. The Nazi Empire was crumbling, and in a mere 2 weeks, the Allies would march into that Flossenburg concentration camp on April 23rd. And a week after that, on April 30th, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. But at the beginning of April, as the Allies were closing in, Hitler was in a hurry to kill the last of his political prisoners. At dawn on April 9th, a guard came to strip Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer naked and walk him to the gallows. The 39-year-old Bonhoeffer had only been at Flossenburg concentration camp for 12 hours, and he was sentenced to death just the prior evening after a quick summary trial. Before arriving at Flossenburg, he'd been at Buchenwald concentration camp for 2 months. The camp where over 56,000 people were killed by the Nazis. And previous to that, Bonhoeffer had been in jail in Berlin for a year and a half. The camp doctor at Flossenburg would later give this account of Bonhoeffer's last few minutes alive. He wrote, "Through a half-open door, I saw Pastor Bonhoeffer, before he was forced to remove his clothing, kneeling on the floor, praying fervently to his God. I was most deeply moved by the way this lovable man prayed, so devout and so certain that God heard his prayer. At the place of execution, he again said a short prayer, and then climbed the steps to the gallows, brave and composed. His death ensued after a few seconds. In the almost 50 years that I've worked as a doctor," he wrote, "I've hardly seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God." So who exactly was Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Well, let's go back earlier in his story, a story that it turns out was intertwined with the story of my own family, namely my grandfather and my uncle. Bonhoeffer's story was also intertwined with the story of Adolf Hitler and the rise of fascism in Germany, since Bonhoeffer was a leading figure in resisting fascism and the Nazi regime. So let's go back 25 years earlier, before Bonhoeffer was executed. The year was 1920, a year after World War I had ended with Germany's humiliating defeat. And an otherwise undistinguished corporal who had served in the war was invited to join the tiny German Workers' Party because of two things he was really good at: his public speaking skills and his skill at propaganda. And who was that? His name was Adolf Hitler. The next year, this German Workers' Party very tiny party of just a few dozen people, had grown to over 100 members and changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party for short. The Nazi political party advocated an extreme form of nationalism. That's why they had the national in the title. And they had desired to embrace all the German people from different countries. Notably, the Nazis also embraced a virulent form of anti-Semitism, a hatred of Jewish people. In the political chaos that ensued after Germany's shameful defeat in World War I, extremism began to rise in German society. Extremism took two forms: fascism and communism. Both of these two political forms are authoritarian, they're totalitarian, and they both violently suppress political opposition. They're both anti-democracy. The main difference are that the fascists, the extreme right wing, advocate extreme nationalism, are led by a dictator, and almost always promote racism as a way of scapegoating people for society's problems. The Nazis were fascists. On the other end, communists, the extreme left wing, are not led by a dictator, but by a dictatorial party leadership. In the middle of these two parties in post-World War I Germany were a centrist party called the German People's Party and another party called the Social Democrat Party. And you may have heard of them because they still exist in Germany to this day, and they are the party that won the most votes in the most recent German election. So the Social Democratic Party is still existing today, and they'll probably have the next Chancellor of Germany. Socialism is quite different from communism. It's often misunderstood. And the Socialist Party in any democratic country is usually helpful because it promotes worker-owned companies and trade unions, a large social safety net, and sometimes federal ownership of essential resources. The main people I think that don't like socialists are corporations that don't want competition from worker-owned companies or state-owned businesses. Because socialism has such a broad popular appeal, people try to borrow its name a lot. And communists often slyly try to put socialist in their party's title to make their authoritarianism seem more palatable. Likewise, in rebranding his German Workers' Party as the National Socialist Party, or the Nazis, Hitler added the word socialist purely as a branding word to populism, even though the party was fascist, not socialist. The president of the German Weimar Republic at this time was Paul von Hindenburg. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because an ill-fated transatlantic hydrogen dirigible was named after him, the Hindenburg. President von Hindenburg was supported by the Centrist Party and the Socialist Party. In 1920, Adolf Hitler became the chief of propaganda for the German Workers' Party. His actions transformed the party, and he held their biggest rally yet, of 2,000 people. And Hitler would later become a big fan of rallies, with himself as the headline speaker, as he began to have adoring fans centered upon him, his personality, and his ego. And as I said, Hitler was the one responsible for rebranding the party and changing the name to the National Socialists, or Nazis. And Hitler personally designed the party's banner of a swastika in a white circle on a red background. The Nazi Party began to grow. By 1928, the Nazi Party had 130,000 members and 12 seats in the government. By 1930, the Nazis had become the second largest party in Germany with 107 seats and became the dominant political force on the right, second only to the Social Democrat Party on the left. The Nazis organized a brown-shirted militia called the Storm Detachment, or the SA in German. The SA would parade in the streets, beat up opponents, and break up their meetings. To counter them, the communists, the extremists on the other end of the spectrum, organized the Red Front. And by 1931, street violence between the SA and the Red Front was increasing. In 1932, von Hindenburg was elected to a second term as president of Germany, persuaded to run by the parties in the center and on the left as the best candidate to defeat Hitler's rising popularity. When von Hindenburg formed his government, he was swayed by his advisors to include 3 Nazi party leaders in his cabinet as a way of placating the right wing of German politics. One of these was Adolf Hitler, who was appointed as Chancellor, a newly created position, second in power only to the president. Precisely 4 weeks after Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor, the Nazis staged an arson attack on the German Capitol building and intentionally blamed the communists for it, with the result that the communists were then banned from holding any seats in government. Eliminating the communists increased the power of the Nazis. In 1934, President von Hindenburg got lung cancer, and Hitler began secretly shoring up his support amongst the German military, the one group that might prevent him from seizing power when von Hindenburg would die. Von Hindenburg remained in the role of president even while he was sick. When von Hindenburg finally died on August 2nd, 1934, within 2 hours of von Hindenburg's death, Hitler dissolved the position of president, merged all of its powers with his own position of chancellor, and effectively became the unchallenged dictator of Germany from then on. That was the day that democracy ended in Germany. Hitler also summoned all of his generals and military leaders to Berlin that day, the day that von Hindenburg died, to renew their oath of allegiance to Germany. Only instead of swearing allegiance to the German Constitution or to the German nation, Hitler surprised them by making them repeat a much different oath after him. And the oath was, "I swear by God this sacred oath, that I will render unconstitutional obedience to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German Reich and of the people and the armed forces, and that I will be ready as a brave soldier to risk my life at any time for this oath." The German officers who took their obedience and their oaths very seriously had been snookered in their hour of grief over von Hindenburg's death into pledging allegiance to Hitler alone. One of the generals, General Ludwig Beck, was horrified and would resign 4 years later, and would become one of the leaders of a failed assassination attempt to kill Hitler on July 20th, 1944. And we'll talk more about that plot later, because it also involves Bonhoeffer. With Hitler's ascent complete, the fascist Nazis then had total power in Germany and would end up exterminating, as I said, over 11 million Jews, political opponents, gypsies, and others. They would also plunge the world into the Second World War, cooperating with other fascist governments in Japan and Italy to make the Axis power. It wasn't until 1945 that the United States, Great Britain, and Russia would together defeat the Nazis and fascism, at the cost of over 405,000 lives of American soldiers. That's what it cost us to defeat fascism. Backtrack now to 1930, 4 years before Hitler's consolidation of power and the destruction of German democracy. We now turn our attention to a young Dietrich Bonhoeffer. 3 years earlier, at the age of 21, Bonhoeffer completed his Doctor of Theology degree from Berlin University, graduating summa cum laude. After getting a doctorate at age 21, in 1930, Bonhoeffer went to the United States for postgraduate study and to teach at New York's Union Theological Seminary. While in New York, Bonhoeffer met Frank Fisher, a black fellow seminarian, who introduced Bonhoeffer to the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, an African-American congregation, where Bonhoeffer would end up teaching Sunday school and forming a lifelong love for African-American hymns and spirituals. While there, Bonhoeffer learned about the social injustices affecting African Americans in the United States. He said that he began to see things from below, from the perspective of those who suffer oppression. He observed, "Here with Black Americans, one can truly speak and hear about sin and grace and the love of God." Dietrich Bonhoeffer then returned to Germany in 1931 to be a lecturer of systematic theology at the University of Berlin. And he transformed during this time from being a theologian, attracted primarily to the intellectual side of Christianity, into being a dedicated person of faith, resolved to carrying out the teachings of Christ as revealed in the Gospels, as he said. Bonhoeffer's promising academic career was dramatically altered with the Nazis' ascension to power and Hitler's installation as chancellor. Bonhoeffer was a determined opponent of the regime from its first days. 2 days after Hitler was installed as chancellor, Bonhoeffer delivered a radio address in which he attacked Hitler and warned Germany against slipping into the idolatrous cult of the Führer, which means leader in German. And he said it could very well turn out to be the Der Führer, or the misleader, or the seducer. Bonhoeffer was cut off the air in the middle of the sentence by the Nazis. In April 1933, Bonhoeffer raised the first voice of church resistance to Hitler's persecution of the Jews. Within months of taking over the government, Hitler took over the German Lutheran Church, which was the official state church of Germany, and therefore subject to government support and control. Take over the church, take over the large portion of the will of the population. So in July of 1933, Hitler unconstitutionally imposed a rigged election for church leadership. And then an overwhelming number of positions went to supporters of the Nazis. And it was Bonhoeffer who was the one who tirelessly campaigned against them, but they ended up losing. The new German bishops went so far as to call Hitler the agent of God. In fall of 1933, the Nazified leadership of the German Lutheran Church passed a resolution that all pastors and church officials who had any Jews in their ancestry were to be removed from their posts. They also passed 3 other resolutions. These are church resolutions. That Adolf Hitler is the completion of the Reformation, that all baptized Jews are to be dismissed from the church, and that the Old Testament is to be excluded from the sacred scriptures because it talks about the Jewish people. Another German Lutheran leader, Pastor Martin Niemöller, founded the Pastors' Emergency League, and more than a third of German pastors joined it, including my mother's father, and my grandfather, Pastor Karl Lewinsky, pastor of St. Michaelis Lutheran Church in inner city Hamburg. The Emergency League became the forerunner of something called the Confessing Church. A leading Lutheran theologian named Karl Barth drafted what became known as the Barmen Declaration, which insisted that Christ, not the Führer, was the head of the church. And the Barmen Declaration became the foundational document of the Confessing Church. I'm going to just advance the slide here. This is what they were resisting. So this is November 19, 1933, called Luther Day. And this is the celebration of the German Evangelical Church. In Germany, they're not called Lutherans, they're called Evangelical, which is why we have ourselves called the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. So you notice here, there's a celebration, here's all the Lutheran pro-Nazi leaders. And what do they have as their flags? The swastikas. And you probably can't see this here, but they made a new flag for the German Lutheran Church, and in the middle of the cross is a swastika. So that's how much they agreed with the brand of Hitler. Back in Hamburg, my grandfather, Pastor Karl Lewinsky, began to preach against the Nazis. And so here is my grandfather here, Pastor Karl Lewinsky. This is his oldest son, Fritz Lewinsky, who was my uncle. He's also killed by the Nazis. And this Young girl in the middle, that's my mother, Hannah Schwabe. Now she's passed away, but she became Hannah Schwabe. So here's my mother, Hannah Lubinsky. So here's my grandfather, Karl Lubinsky. So he would preach against the Nazis. And as he would preach against the Nazis on Sunday morning, 2 Gestapo men would sit every Sunday in uniform in the pew directly in front of him as a way of trying to intimidate him. But he bravely preached anyway. My grandfather died of tuberculosis in 1938, just before World War II began, where he surely would have been arrested by the Nazis. And there's his church in the inner city Hamburg, St. Michaelis Church. Good name, huh? St. Michael? St. Michaelis Church, right there. And that's the church where my mother grew up. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, meanwhile, was offered the position of pastor in a church in East Berlin. But Bonhoeffer refused to take that church out of protest to the nationalist policies of the German Lutheran Church. Instead, Bonhoeffer went to London for 2 years to be the pastor of 2 German-speaking Protestant churches, hoping to forge an international church coalition to oppose Hitler and fascism. While Bonhoeffer was away in London, theologian Karl Barth, the drafter of the Barmen Declaration, urged Bonhoeffer to return to Germany, saying that Bonhoeffer was wasting his theological talents, while back in Germany, the house of your church is on fire. So in 1935, Bonhoeffer returned to Germany to lead an underground seminary, secret seminary in a town called Dingenwald. And this underground seminary was for the purpose of training confessing church pastors. One of those students who enrolled in the seminary was my uncle, Fritz Ludinsky, right there. He was the son of my grandfather, as I said, and the older brother of my mother. While at the underground seminary, Fritz completed both a professional pastor's degree and a PhD at the same time. Fritz Levinsky was also a highly accomplished jazz pianist. And it's funny that Bonhoeffer was so attracted to the African American spirituals. My uncle Fritz just loved playing jazz piano. Was really good at it. So I kind of imagined them maybe like doing music together or something. So Fritz Levinsky became one of the students of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. As the Nazi suppression of the confessing church intensified, theologian Karl Barth fled to Switzerland months after Bonhoeffer's return. And in August 1936, Bonhoeffer's authorization to teach at the University of Berlin was revoked after he was denounced by a pro-Nazi Lutheran bishop as a pacifist and as an enemy of the state. So Bonhoeffer doubled down on his efforts. Bonhoeffer doubled down on his efforts to keep the underground seminaries going, including securing necessary funds for them. Later, he fell in love with the granddaughter of one of his benefactors. She was a lot younger than him. Her name was Maria von Wiedemeyer, and they became engaged 3 months before Bonhoeffer's arrest in 1943. But August 1937, the Nazis decreed that education and the examination of confessing church ministry candidates was illegal. In September 1937, this is 2 years before the war started, the Gestapo closed the seminary at Dingenwald, and by November they had arrested 27 pastors and former students. It was around this time that Bonhoeffer published his best-known book, called The Cost of Discipleship. It was a study of Sermon on the Mount, and in this Cost of Discipleship, he attacked something called cheap grace. He wrote that cheap grace is forgiveness without requiring repentance, and faith without personal cost and sacrifice. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, and without Jesus Christ. The opposite of cheap grace, according to Bonhoeffer, was costly grace. Costly grace, he wrote, is the gospel, which must be sought again and again and again. It is the gift which must be asked for. Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow. And it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly, wrote Bonhoeffer, because it costs a person their life. And it is grace because it gives a person the only true life. It's costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it is costly grace because it costs God the life of his Son. And what has cost God much cannot be cheap for us. Above all, it is grace because God did not reckon his Son too dear a price to be paid for, but delivered him up for us. Costly grace, wrote Bonhoeffer, is the incarnation of God. Kind of summarize the way that Bonhoeffer directed his whole theology. Costly grace, personal sacrifice. Besides his book, The Cost of Discipleship, Bonhoeffer also wrote another famous book called Life Together, based on Bonhoeffer's communal life and teaching at the underground seminaries. Bonhoeffer spent the next 2 years secretly traveling from one East German village to another to conduct a seminary on the run and supervise his students, one of whom was my Uncle Fritz. Another student was Eberhard Bethke, the student who, unlike my uncle, was able to survive, and who would later edit and publish Bonhoeffer's letters and papers from prison. In 1937, July 1937, Martin Niemöller, who I told you was the founder of the Confessing Church, was arrested and imprisoned in concentration camps for 8 years as the personal prisoner of Adolf Hitler. Concentration camps were not just for Jews, they were for political opponents. So Hitler wanted Niemöller to be his personal prisoner. Well, at one of the camps, Martin Niemöller penned these famous words. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. In 1938, the Gestapo banned Bonhoeffer from Berlin. In February 1939, Bonhoeffer learned that war was imminent. As a pacifist, he was particularly troubled by the prospect of being conscripted. He was opposed to the Nazi regime and would never swear an oath to Hitler or fight in his army, even though refusal to do so was potentially a capital offense. You get killed. It was at this juncture that Bonhoeffer left Germany for the United States in June of 1939 at the invitation of Union Theological Seminary in New York, where he previously taught. After 2 weeks, only 2 weeks amid much inner turmoil, he regretted his decision and returned to Germany, despite strong pressure from friends telling him to stay in the United States. He wrote, I've come to the conclusion that I made a mistake in coming to America. I must live through this difficult period in our national history with the people of Germany. I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people. Christians in Germany will have to face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make that choice from the faraway position of security. Bonhoeffer returned to Germany and assumed leadership of the underground seminary. In 1939, the seminary moved to Sigurdshof. In March 1940, following the outbreak of World War II, the Gestapo shut down that seminary also. At this time, Bonhoeffer was further harassed by the Nazi authorities as he was forbidden to speak in public and was required regularly to report his activities to the police. In 1941, he was forbidden to print or to publish. Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law was a member of the German military intelligence unit called the Abwehr. And Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law was also secretly a member of the resistance, along with some other members of this German military intelligence unit. He told the others in the unit that Bonhoeffer's wide ecumenical contacts in other countries could be of use to Germany, thus protecting Bonhoeffer from being conscripted into active service if he go into the military intelligence unit, but also made Bonhoeffer officially a part of the resistance. In reality, Bonhoeffer's international contacts were useful for the resistance. Under cover of the Abwehr military unit, Bonhoeffer served as a courier for the German resistance movement to reveal its existence and intentions to Western allies in hopes of garnering support. Through his ecumenical contacts abroad, Bonhoeffer was able to secure possible peace terms with the Allies for a post-Hitler government. Bonhoeffer's visits to Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Switzerland were camouflaged as legitimate intelligence activities for the Abwehr. In reality, as I said, he was a double agent. However, Bonhoeffer and his brother-in-law were discovered and arrested on April 5th, 1943, and imprisoned in Berlin. And then came the famous assassination attempt to kill Adolf Hitler, a plot, a coup. Although Bonhoeffer was a pacifist, as part of the resistance, he was involved in the plot. Bonhoeffer likened Hitler to a madman driving a bus barreling dangerously down a highway, and said that Hitler's hands must be taken off the wheel. But as a pacifist, he was ethically in turmoil over his part in an assassination plot. He wrote, "The ultimate question for a responsible man to ask is not how he is to extricate himself heroically from the affair, but how the coming generation shall continue to live." Bonhoeffer did not justify his action, but accepted that he was taking guilt upon himself when he wrote, "When a man takes guilt upon himself and responsibility, he imputes his guilt to himself and no one else. He answers for it. Before other people, he is justified by dire necessity. Before himself, he is acquitted by his conscience. But before God, he hopes only for grace." The leader of the plot to kill Hitler and stage a coup was Lieutenant Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. Another leader was that same general that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, retired General Ludwig Beck, the same general who was so upset by Hitler making the members of the military pledge allegiance to Hitler personally. The plot was codenamed Valkyrie, and there was even a movie made about it. On July 20th, 1944, von Stauffenberg left a bomb in a briefcase under a table in a conference room and exited just before Hitler came into the room for a meeting. But as one of the attending officers came and sat down, that officer saw the briefcase at his feet and pushed the briefcase out of the way and to the opposite side of this massive oak central support under the table, pushing it away from Hitler. 4 people were killed in the blast, but Hitler survived with only minor injuries, shielded by the table leg from the explosion. Afterward, General Fromm, who had been part of the plot, got scared, and in an effort to show allegiance to Hitler, turned in his co-conspirators. Many were tortured to give up additional names before they were killed. In all, nearly 200 conspirators were shot, hanged, or strangled with piano wire. Even General Fromm himself was executed. In September, secret documents in the Abwehr military intelligence unit that Bonhoeffer and his brother-in-law had been part of were discovered. And these were documents relating to the coup attempt, and the Gestapo found them. Among those people named as part of the resistance in the Abwehr was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was immediately transferred from his Berlin prison to a Gestapo high-security prison, and from there transferred to the concentration camps to be executed. On Sunday, April 8th, 1945, the day before he was killed, Bonhoeffer was in a van with 14 other political prisoners. on his way to the Flossenburg concentration camp, where he would be executed in less than 24 hours. The van broke down, and Bonhoeffer and the others were put into a schoolhouse beside the road. Since it was Sunday morning, one of the prisoners, a Catholic, begged Bonhoeffer to conduct a small service for them. Bonhoeffer agreed. He prayed and read the appointed scriptures for the day. Isaiah 35:5, which goes, "By his stripes we are healed." And 1 Peter 1:3, which goes, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. By his great mercy we are born anew into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead." Bonhoeffer then explained the verses to everyone. One of his fellow prisoners who survived recalled how Bonhoeffer spoke to us in a manner which reached the hearts of all, finding just the right words to express the spirit of our imprisonment and the thoughts which it had brought. Bonhoeffer then concluded with another prayer. He had hardly finished his prayer when the door opened and two Gestapo men entered. They had found another van to take Bonhoeffer the rest of the way to the concentration camp. "Prisoner Bonhoeffer, come with us," they said. And as he bade goodbye to everyone, he drew aside a friend and said to the friend, "This is the end. For me, it is the beginning of life." At dawn the next morning, Bonhoeffer was hanged. 3 years earlier, and less than 8 months before Bonhoeffer was arrested in jail, my uncle Fritz Lubinsky was rounded up along with other students from the underground seminary. Uncle Fritz was ordered to be enlisted to fight at the Russian front. But in reality, Uncle Fritz never made it that far. A friend of his later told my grandmother that Fritz was found shot in the back of the head, far from the front lines, likely executed by a German political officer. In a strange encounter, my grandmother actually learned about her son's impending death 3 days before he actually died, on August 21st, 1942. It turns out that the ever-efficient Germans had pre-scheduled Fritz's execution and had sent out his death notification beforehand to be delivered 4 days after his supposed death at the Russian front. But the German soldier who was delivering the death notifications made a mistake and delivered the death notification to my grandmother 1 week too early. When she opened it up, in horror, my grandmother discovered that the date of death was listed as being 3 days from then. When she pointed this out to the mail carrier, to the soldier who delivered the death notifications, he got all flustered and quickly left. So along with Dietrich Bonhoeffer and so many others, my Uncle Fritz was also a martyr for the faith. So here's Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and here's a memorial of him in front of St. Peter's Church in Hamburg. And he, along with my grandfather, my uncle, and so many others, are the ones who stood up to Hitler. And if their legacy of faith, if Bonhoeffer's legacy of faith teaches us anything, is that the gospel of Jesus Christ compels us to bravely stand up against fascism, racism, and the violent evil inherent in both of them. Like Bonhoeffer, we are called to stand together with all who are oppressed, whether they be persecuted Jews or African Americans whom Bonhoeffer befriended back in New York City. And we are called to practice what Bonhoeffer called costly grace. We are called to not to pledge allegiance to any fascist dictator, but to Christ alone. And as practitioners of costly grace, we practice the kind of grace that demands from us self-sacrifice and risk, as we oppose the violent systems of this world, and we give witness to the love and mercy of the kingdom of God. So thank you for participating in today's presentation. Next month, Sunday, November 14th, we'll have part 2 of the series. We'll watch a movie about Bonhoeffer. So we're going to have a movie about that. And now I'm going to turn the recording off, say goodbye to the people watching online, and take some questions and comments from you. So thank you.